Voters across Russia's 11 time zones polling for the second day in the country's presidential election, with incumbent President Vladimir Putin being all but certain to secure the fifth term. In the meantime, Moscow accused Ukraine of stepping up attacks and says their aim is to derail Russian voting. Dasha Chernyshyova has more from Moscow on this.
Some 27 million Russians cast their ballots on the first day of presidential election, with a countrywide turnout exceeding 30%, according to the Central Election Commission. Several people have been detained over acts of vandalism when paint was poured into ballot boxes and arson attacks. Criminal cases have been opened, and authorities say those attacks were instigated from abroad. They also say that the number of spoiled ballots is not significant. In the meantime, Moscow accused Ukraine of stepping up attacks against civilian targets in Russia, with voting carried out in Belgorod region as air raid sirens were going on and off throughout the day. President Putin said the purpose of those attacks was to disrupt the presidential election. However, he said Kyiv will not be able to prevent the process of expressing people's will. He said that Russian air defense systems have repelled over 95% of Kyiv's attacks.
In an attempt to disrupt the voting process and intimidate people, at least in the regions bordering Ukraine, the Kyiv neo-Nazi regime has planned and is trying to carry out a series of criminal demonstrative armed actions.
Moscow also accused Ukraine of attempting to cross the Russian border using more than 2,500 personnel, 35 tanks and about 40 armored vehicles over the past days. Those attempts have failed. Voting will continue throughout the weekend. Dasha Chernyshyova reported in Moscow for DD India.
UN Security Council members condemned Russia's efforts to conduct its presidential election in Ukraine-controlled areas on Friday. In a show of unity, 56 UN ambassadors stood by Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, Sergei Kyriasis. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of trying to disrupt Russian presidential election and said that Moscow would punish Kyiv for its latest attacks. The first of the 3 days of voting was marked by disruptions, including dye being poured into ballot boxes and cyber attacks. During a St. Patrick's Day luncheon at the U.S. Capitol on Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden and Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar pledged unwavering support for Ukraine.
People around the world, they can always count on Ireland and the United States to be on their side, not just for hope, but to help them on their march forward. We see this in our support of Ukraine and the people in the face of Putin's vicious onslaught against Ukraine. America stands up for freedom, and we bow down to no one in the world.
A Russian ballistic missile attack hit a residential area in Ukraine's Black Sea port city of Odessa on Friday, killing at least 20 people. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia would receive a fair response from Ukrainian forces for the strike.
In Odessa, the rescue operation and provision of aid is still underway following the Russian missile strike. It was a very wild strike. Among those killed and injured are paramedics, rescuers from emergency services. Our defense forces will certainly do everything to ensure that the Russian killers feel our fair response.
In a bid to showcase European unity towards Ukraine, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron and Polish counterpart Donald Tusk in Berlin on Friday. At a joint press conference, German Chancellor asserted on acquiring more weapons for the conflict-hit country. This recent meeting comes after last month's Franco-German spat in a summit in Paris, where French President Emmanuel Macron refused to rule out deploying Western troops to Ukraine, triggering a dressing down from Scholz. Friday's tripartite meeting was conducted to work on tensions between the allies. The European disagreement comes as US support for Ukraine is also weakening.
We have agreed on a few main issues, and among others, we will acquire even more weapons for Ukraine, in fact on the entire world market. We will use windfall profits from Russian assets which are frozen in Europe to fund the purchase of weapons for Ukraine.
Durch Zusammenarbeit mit Partnern in der Ukraine.
Some European Union member states, in fact, are reportedly against the bloc using profits from frozen Russian assets in the West to buy weapons for Ukraine. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen suggested the idea a few weeks ago, and it's likely to be front and center on the agenda when the heads of the 27-nation bloc meet in Brussels next week. Ishan Garg tells us more.
Hungary, Slovakia, Malta and Luxembourg are among countries reportedly against using money from frozen Russian assets to buy weapons. Hungary and Slovakia are considered closest to Russia in the European Union, while Malta and Luxembourg could be against the idea due to their commitment to neutrality. Now, EU heads of states had previously agreed to use profits from Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine, but after Commission President Ursula von der Leyen suggested using the money to buy weapons to defend Ukraine instead, cracks are emerging within the bloc. The bloc's top diplomat Josep Borrell says stopping the immediate destruction of Ukraine is more crucial than the eventual reconstruction of the country. Analysts expect there could be some agreement on the best way to utilize the funds down the line, but it may now not happen in the European Council meeting next week when the heads of state meet in Brussels. There are expectations, though, that the leaders might call for the money from the assets to be used for a common defense fund that could potentially be used to buy ammunition for Ukraine. But the possible purchase of more deadly arms is a divisive issue. Smaller members of the bloc are hesitant to be seen as direct contributors to the war against Moscow. Russian assets worth about 250 to 300 billion euros are frozen in the West. About 70% are held here in Brussels. A central securities clearing company called Euroclear holds them. Officials estimate that the total assets could generate up to 20 billion euros in profits by 2027. About 3 to 4 billion euros could be available as soon as this year. Across the pond, though, in the United States, there is a push to get the EU to seize all of the frozen Russian assets instead of just the profits. However, many in the EU are worried about the financial and legal implications of it. Ishan Garg in Brussels, reporting for DD India.